to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I am very pleased to welcome Bruce Gagnon back to Wider View. Bruce is the Secretary and Coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space since he helped create the organization back in 1992. Bruce is a Vietnam War veteran and a longtime member of Veterans for Peace as well. He spoke with me by Skype from his home in Brunswick, Maine. My last episode of my podcast, I was talking with Phil Giraldi and asked him what he thought that we should talk about, that maybe I hadn't brought up. And he said the most important thing to discuss is we're talking about a potential for nuclear war. We're playing games in areas like Syria, where there's a high possibility that the U.S. and Russia will come into contact militarily, and that could lead to nuclear war. I know you've been working a lot on that issue recently. Maybe you can talk about reasons that we're getting closer to nuclear war and what you're trying to do about that.
Well, I think you're right. I think that is a real danger right now. I think the arrogance of the United States and NATO is really, really amazing and amazingly frightening. Just a few weeks ago, concluded war games up in Norway, Sweden, and Finland aimed at Russia. This has to do with the melting of the Arctic ice because of climate change. And Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic Sea. Years ago, the Rand Corporation in California became famous for the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg was working. He smuggled them out. Got him to the media. The Rand Corporation is saying that we need to break Russia up into pieces, into smaller countries, so that the oil corporations, the resource extraction corporations, will have an easier job. The Rand Corporation wants to break Russia up into smaller countries so that the resource extraction corporations will have greater access to that region where the ice is melting. I think so much of what's going on is aimed around that issue.
I think you're right about that. I mean, there's the global climate change is driving a lot of this military buildup and a lot of this aggression toward other countries. Is that what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and particularly at Russia. The other thing that's really, in this regard of nuclear, a possible nuclear war, is the U.S. is working on battlefield nuclear weapons, reducing the megatonnage, if you will, of nuclear weapons so they're not so big and that they would be able to use them in battlefield situations. The U.S. currently has nuclear weapons that would be dropped by airplanes, fighter bombers that are stationed in Belgium and Germany and NATO bases. And they're talking about putting these smaller yield nuclear weapons on those planes. That should be freaking out Europe. And it's really kind of strange that the Europeans aren't talking more about these dangers, especially after the U.S. pulled out of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Another thing that is really, I think, one of the most dangerous of all is the encirclement of Russia with various missile defense systems. Missile defense being the shield that would be used after the first strike attack sword plunges into the heart of Russia and China, something that they annually war game at the U.S. Space Command. The red team versus the blue team, they call it. And then in that computer war game, the U.S. uses many different scenarios to try to take out Russian and Chinese nuclear weapons. And then after that initial attack takes place by the US, Russia and China tries to fire a retaliatory strike. And it is then that these so-called missile defense shields would be used to pick them off. Well, one of the ways they deploy these missile defense systems is on Navy Aegis destroyers that are made at Bath Iron Works, just 10 miles from where I live here in Maine. And they've had the best testing so far. There are a whole bunch of different kind of missile defense systems. Some are testing better than others. Some are doing very poorly. But the ones on the Aegis destroyers are having the best rate. And as a result of that, the Pentagon is saying, let's take that system and not only leave it on the ships, but let's start deploying it on land as a launch system. They call it Aegis Ashore. They've now put a Aegis Ashore launch complex in Kauai, Hawaii, and they've built a Aegis Ashore launch complex in Romania and are now building one in Poland. And so this really frightens Russia a lot. In addition to that, on the ships, on the Aegis destroyers, these platforms, these Aegis Ashore launch platforms on the ships, and now the ones on land, not only can fire these interceptor missiles, they call them SM-3, Standard Missile 3, missile defense interceptors, but they also can be used to fire first strike attack nuclear capable cruise missiles. This is what's freaking out Russia the most, because Russia doesn't know when something is launched from Romania or Poland initially if it's a so-called missile defense system or if it's a first strike attack cruise missile. And these cruise missiles would be able to reach Moscow in 10 to 12 minutes. Well, this is extremely, extremely provocative. Just imagine during the height of the Cold War, the former Soviet Union, if the US ever tried to do half the things it's doing today with bases right along the Russian border, now these missile launch facilities right along the Russian border, we would have gone to nuclear war then. And so clearly we're inciting the possibility of a nuclear exchange. So I think this is incredibly, incredibly insane what the US is doing today.
Yeah, and one of the things that strikes me is we talk about these when you proliferate the number of launch methodologies for these missiles, and you couple that with this reduction in the megatonnage, to the battlefield nuclear weapons. We're also, no doubt, talking about lowering the level of command at which these weapons might be launched. So we might have a situation where a battlefield commander takes it upon him or herself to launch one of these things, and there we all go.
That's right. And the Russians and the Chinese have declared no first use policy.
Right.
They will never launch first nuclear weapons. They would only use their capability in a retaliatory strike. U.S. refuses to declare such a no first use policy. In addition, the Russians and Chinese have been going to the United Nations for more than 20 years, every year, introducing a new international treaty to prevent an arms race in space. They call it PAROS, P-A-R-O-S, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. And they bring it to the floor at the General Assembly as a resolution. Everybody in the world votes in favor of it except the U.S. and Israel. Now and then they get somebody like Marshall Islands to come along because they tell them that if they don't also vote against it, they're going to block their funding. But usually it's just the U.S. and Israel. And so it never gets into full negotiations at the UN Permanent Conference on Disarmament in Geneva because of this blockage by the U.S. and Israel. Well, the idea is to close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. Let's ban all weapons in space. But the U.S. clearly sees that its day as a bully on the top of the hill, bully on the block, is waning.
He's, yeah.
That a multipolar world is coming into fruition, and they have just a tiny, narrow sliver of time left where they can try to regain their global dominance. And so all of these things, withdrawing from treaties, blocking treaties, surrounding Russia and China with so-called missile defense systems, with new radars, with new first strike capabilities, NATO expansion towards Russia and even into the Asia Pacific now, encircling China. They're signing up new partners, I call them, in NATO, in Japan and South Korea, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, and other countries as well. So this, what I call steroidal NATO, is really adding fuel to the fire in a big way.
Right. Well, so Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said yesterday that Washington's working to start a new arms race. He said, I'm quoting him now, "I want to emphasize that they will not be able to involve Russia in this costly exercise." And then I read this morning that the U.S. Army top brass are currently briefing their commanders all over the world. Why we have commanders all over the world is another question. But about new weapon systems they're bringing online, $54 billion apparently of additional weapon systems to help prepare for a war against Russia and China. So obviously Lavrov is absolutely correct about what's going on. But I think when we look at the defense budgets of these two countries, there's really no comparison. Our government is simply manufacturing this threat.
That's right. Let's talk about that. When you add up all the U.S. military expenditures, what goes to the Pentagon, the nuclear weapons is in the Department of Energy budget, all the various pieces, what I call pots of gold that the Pentagon has access to. When you add it all up, it's $1 trillion a year that the U.S. is spending on military. Russia is spending $66 billion a year on the military. $66 billion. It's virtually nothing in comparison to what the U.S. is spending. When you add up NATO expenditures to the U.S. totals, it's more than 50% of the global total of military spending by the U.S. and NATO. Russia comes in about 3.8%. It's enormous disparity. And the corporate media, just think about this for a minute. Why are they hammering away on all this Russiagate stuff that has yet to be proven to be anything real? Especially the Democrats. They're like leading the chorus on this.
Absolutely.
Well, it's clear to me that it's to prepare the American people for this massive expenditure, to get the American people to acquiesce to this massive expenditure of money that is benefiting these weapons corporations, that benefits the elected officials in Washington who are in the pockets of these weapons corporations. So it's a massive redistribution of wealth in this nation, away from social progress, away from needed infrastructure repair, away from environmental repair, from dealing with climate change, our real problem, and all aimed at encircling Russia, to put a loaded gun, literally a loaded gun, to the head of Russia and China, telling them, okay, you think you're going to be part of this multipolar world where decision making is done on in a shared way? Well, forget about it. We're still in charge, and we've got this loaded gun pointed at your head. We've got you entirely surrounded. Get on your knees and surrender to us now, or else you're going to be taken out. That's the threat.
Yeah. Well, and as you say, too, I mean, I think what people don't realize is this is a threat to the well-being of American citizens. I mean, these record amounts of money, coupled with the reductions in taxes on the wealthy and the corporations who are paying pretty much zero, that money's got to come from somewhere, and they're already talking about where it's going to come from: Social Security, Medicare, any kind of programs for housing or for any of our needs, education, forget about it. And we're not getting any of that because all the money has to go into the war machine.
That's right. They're hollowing out our country. They don't give a damn about America anymore. They've gone global. They're using us as an instrument. They're using the American people, the taxpayers, as an instrument to fund their global war machine as they try to, in this period of history, to take full control of the planet on behalf of corporate resource extraction interests, oil, water, minerals, natural gas, you name it. They're going for the whole schmear. And some years ago, during the George W. Bush administration, I was watching C-SPAN one evening, and they had a speaker, a 3-hour presentation by a guy by the name of Thomas Barnett. He was introduced as Donald Rumsfeld's strategy guy. He, at that time, was a professor at the Naval War College in Rhode Island. He had written a new book called The Pentagon's New Map. He had a very high-tech PowerPoint presentation where he showed that there were parts of the world that were not submitting to U.S. control and corporate control. And those were Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. So when you see where we're doing wars today, destabilizing, it's following that map. But one thing he said that I'll never forget, we're not going to do treaties anymore because they'll restrict our ability to dominate. And more importantly, he said, we're not going to have jobs in America anymore. Our role under corporate globalization of the world economy will not be to make things. We're not going to make things anymore. Our job will be security export. And so it's no coincidence today that our number one industrial export product is weapons. And what we do is war on behalf of these corporate interests. And he talked about young people, angry young people, no jobs, whiling away their time playing video games. We want to bring them into the military and send them overseas into this non-integrating gap, as he called it, to secure it on behalf of U.S. corporate control.
Yeah, I think we call that bringing stability. Yeah, that's what we call it now. You know, what one thing that strikes me, you mentioned the Democrats earlier. We're starting into a presidential campaign. I mean, why? We're 18 months away, but okay, whatever. We're starting a presidential campaign now, and none of the major candidates is talking about foreign policy, American imperialism, the military budget. I mean, thankfully have at least one minor candidate, Tulsi Gabbard, who's making some noises in this area, but nobody among the front runners is even discussing this.
You know, I haven't voted for a Democrat since Walter Mondale ran for president. That's been a while.
Yes.
That's almost ancient history now, you know. But I have to say, I've been really impressed with Tulsi Gabbard. She's really, really, I mean, I've seen her on national television say that the U.S. created ISIS, funded, directed ISIS. She's talking about these regime change wars. She's talking about the dangers of war with Russia and China. And she's talking about cutting the military budget and dealing with our problems at home. So she's really, bottom line, saying a lot of the same things we're saying. She got the 65,000 individual donors, so she's going to be allowed to be in the first round or so of debate. But they're going to be working inside the Democratic Party to restrict her. I watch the mainstream media when they talk about the viable candidates. She's never included. They're ignoring her as best they can. So I'm impressed with her. One person I'm really disappointed with is Bernie Sanders, because he never talks about, Lisa, I never hear him talking about these issues, these military issues. He wants to have free health care. He wants to have free education. I agree with him on all that. But where are you going to get the money to do that unless you cut the military budget? Where are you going to get the money to deal with climate change, to build national rail system, to build wind turbines? where are you going to get the money unless you cut the military budget? And so Sanders doesn't go anywhere near that. So it's our job really to raise these questions. And I think everybody should pay attention to what Tulsi Gabbard is saying.
I've been telling people, although she gets a lot of negative comments, even from the left, there are reasons not to like every candidate. But I have to say, I mean, I've been taking the position that I want her in the debates. I want the American people to hear about these options, to hear the truth about what's going on. And none of the other candidates appear ready to do that.
Well, sadly, I have to say, just based on my lifetime of experience working in the peace movement, my entire adult life, I've stopped being surprised that every election cycle, there are people on the quote unquote left who in the end run and support the Democratic Party. And particularly people like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or yes, Bill Clinton or even Barack Obama. And so often there are people that presume to be on the left, that presume to share our opinions on things, that in the end support the very candidates who are making the wars. I remember in the height of the Obama administration, the Washington Post reported on a poll that they had done asking Republicans and Democrats if they supported Obama's drone program. And I was shocked. I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked to see that self-identified liberal Democrats by 70% supported Obama's drone program. Now, a lot of these people, you talk to them and they say, yeah, of course, I'm part of the peace movement. But then how in the hell can you support Obama's drone program, killing innocent civilians by the legions? So, it's all about party. People say, as long as my party's in power, I'm going to support my president all the way down the line. We see it when Republicans are in office, and we see it when Democrats are in office. And so I don't consider anybody a part of the peace movement or even part of the left unless they have the capability of having a critical mind and a critical articulation against these warmongers, no matter what party they're in.
Switch gears a bit. I think when I contacted you a few days ago, you said you were heading off to Russia again very soon, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what you're going to be doing there and what your impressions are of Russia and its people, our alleged enemy.
So I'd never been to Russia. I went last October. I went to Moscow and Crimea all together for about almost 2 weeks. And it was a very interesting experience. I met a lot of really wonderful people, friendly people, intelligent people, people who knew more about the United States than Americans know about Russia or many other countries. And I went there, though, in order to prepare for this study tour that we're taking, leaving on April 24th to go to Russia, where we're going to have about 21 people from several countries, global network members, and also 7 members of Veterans for Peace. So we're going to Moscow and then Crimea and then St. Petersburg. And on our last day in St. Petersburg, May 9th, we've been invited to join the Immortal Regiment Peace March, where the Russian people every May 9th have their most sacred holiday of all. Right. It's the time when they remember the defeat of the Nazis by the Allies. Something the U.S. never talks about, though, is that defeat had a lot to do with Hitler getting bogged down in the Soviet Union, killing 28 million Soviet citizens in that invasion of the Soviet Union. But the Russians basically beat Hitler. And so they have a peace march where people hold pictures of their relatives, their uncles, their grandfathers, their, all that. The people that fought against the Russians died stopping the Nazis in their onslaught of the former Soviet Union. So, but our purpose for going is to stand up against this demonization and say, we have our own minds. We're going to meet the people. We're building a peace bridge between us. Back in the days of the former Soviet Union, when I first started in the peace movement in the early 80s at the height of the Cold War, politicians actually talked about peace. Even Ronald Reagan, he's the one that negotiated the INF Treaty that got rid of nuclear missiles in Europe on both sides. So things have really changed a lot these days, where the Democrats are now the biggest war drum bangers of all. It's amazing. And it really shows me what that party is made out of. It's become a complete, total corporate tool of the military-industrial complex. So we're going there, and people are going to come home and share their stories, what they learn, what they experience. But I'm a firm believer the best way to see people change is to create experiences for them. I think this experience is going to have a big impact on people.
I had a few other questions, but maybe there are things that you would like to talk about that we haven't discussed.
Well, I think the most important thing I would want to say is that we have to convert the military-industrial complex. It's one of my mantras. Every time I do a radio interview or everywhere I speak, I always finish with this. Our biggest problem in the world today is not Russia or China or Al-Qaeda. Our biggest problem is ourselves, the way we're polluting this planet, killing this planet by our lifestyle, by our fossil fuel lifestyle. And we have to convert that. And it has to be done now. It has to be done yesterday. And again, the only way we can afford to do this, completely reorient our society, is cut the military budget, use that money to create a green future. And studies at UMass Amherst, Brown University in Rhode Island, studies show that if we did this, we get more jobs than we currently get building weapons for endless war on behalf of corporate interests. So I was just out today for an hour and a half with a friend in the cold. Started raining on us at Bath Iron Works, where they're building these destroyers outfitted with these missile defense systems, with a sign that says, "Are we building a sustainable future yet?" And we were handing out flyers where we're connecting this climate change to and the conversion argument together. We're doing it statewide. We've made thousands of these flyers. We're distributing them around the state. We're having a letter to the editor campaign to newspapers around the state. We're having congressional meetings with congressional staffers at their offices all over the state, and really trying to educate the public and the politicians and the workers at these military production facilities that we've got to make a change now, today. And so I see it as a win-win-win. It's a win for labor unions because they get more jobs. It's a win for the peace movement because we lower this steroidal military endless war cycle that we're in today. And it's a win-win for the environmental groups who are struggling to deal with climate change. Sadly, most environmental groups don't want to talk about the military budget. They don't want to talk to the peace community about the ideas of conversion. Somehow they think the money is going to magically appear, come out of nowhere, like manna from heaven, and they're going to be able to transform the country. Forget it. It ain't going to happen. We've got to call for the conversion of the military-industrial complex.
You're absolutely right. Bruce, I really appreciate all the work you do. I wish you well in Russia and hope you have a great trip.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for having me on again.
That's our show for this week. Thanks again to Bruce Gagnon. Check the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com for links to Bruce's blog and information on the global network against weapons and nuclear power in space. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.